right, so in point of fact, that is not what my talk's going to be about. So I've spent a pretty substantial career spending all of my time exploring over the far horizon. And when I was thinking about this particular event, what I tried to do is figure out how to grab some stuff on the other side of that horizon that I thought might be legible and useful to folks interested in this space, and try to package it up and deliver it here. So the frame that I'm working with right now is if you're serious about the category that network states is a part of, this talk is for you. And what I'm going to try to do is bring in concepts that are not, I think, currently very mainstream, but I think are important, perhaps even necessary, and that are about 2 to 7 years in the future from where Balaji is currently setting his focal point. So a few key ideas for the preamble to just kind of set the frame that I'm operating from. So the big picture here is that for a wide variety of different reasons, we are actually in the middle of what is known as a major historical transition, at least at the order of magnitude of the one that moved us from the medieval age to the modern era that we've been part of for the past half a millennium. And a key thing to keep in mind here is there's a number of different pieces that come with that transformation. One is that the institutions that we've been living with for the past 500 years, certainly for the past 100 years, are strictly incapable of actually navigating this transition on their own. And this is actually very important to keep in mind, right? By hypothesis, what this model tells us is that we don't really even have to worry that much about the FDA because they are in the process of being chewed up by the fact that they can't actually deal with the environment that they're trying to navigate. That doesn't mean that we aren't lifted up from trying to build, what was it called? FD-DAO? But it puts a little bit more intensity behind it. We are actually facing a situation where we have to build these new institutions, and the old institutions are going away, unfortunately, rather rapidly. So for those of you who are doing it, I want to provide a note of encouragement. This is actually a historic, heroic endeavor, and it's going to be actually much harder than I think many people think. Next part of the preamble. Many people, I think, take a narrow look at the problem domain. They focus on the piece of it that is in front of them. In fact, in this world, it's typically an engineering problem, or sometimes a technical engineering problem. And what I want to remind is that this is going to be a holistic problem. For example, a psycho-spiritual problem, a cultural problem, in addition to being a technical engineering problem. And we have to look at all of those different aspects. Notably, one of the key elements that is often lost is that when we go through these kinds of transitions, a big part of the movement, of course, is innovation, new things. But another big part of the movement is actually going back and recovering things that were erased during the previous movement. All right, so I'll give you an example. We typically these days operate with a false dichotomy between the market and the state, and we try to partition functions between them and sometimes in relationship with them. But this is because we've spent 500 years erasing the more fundamental piece of what is actually a triad. The commons. Now, what's interesting about this term is when I started actually realizing that this triad was actually fundamental, I had to renovate the concept of commons in my own mind. I heard of it and thought of things like small shareholder farming communities in England and stuff like that. But it's actually vastly more fundamental. And if you can really grasp it as a notion, you can begin to think about how to properly architect a new city, a new state, a new category. Whoops, where's my little thing? There you go. Here's the kinds of things that properly actually belong in the commons. And here's the key. It's more fundamental than either the market or the state. And if you have the commons actually built correctly, with the right stuff in it being governed properly, then the market does what the market does, the state does what the state does, and they don't try to cross over. So things like law, money. Right around here, that's not that confusing, but in the rest of the world it is. Things like language, somewhat obviously if you really think about it. Family in the broad category known as sense-making, that includes things like journalism and science. This is not a function of the market, and it's not a function of the state. It's properly a function of the commons. We have to figure out a way to think about that in a new way. And we also have to figure out how to actually do it in this new environment. So what are the proper content of the commons? How are we going to begin to rebuild that in a new fashion? And then I'm going to throw out one last piece, which is the fundamental characteristic of the commons and is really not on the radar right now, and that's religion. So in the content of the commons, I mentioned money, right? For most part, most states these days believe that money belongs to the state, and it's a function the state provides to the market. I'm simply going to propose by fiat that it actually belongs to the commons, to the people. And those of us coming from the crypto community live that on a daily basis. When you hear about the way, the how, you'll understand what I'm talking about deeply. Law as well. This is super interesting. Oftentimes we again think that law belongs to the state in the sense of legislation. But in fact, common law is the fundamental basis of all law in the West, particularly the English common law. And when we think about the notion of code is law, this is the new renovation of the concept of the common law, and therefore the law of the commons. Here's another one, the marketplace of ideas as a concept. It's actually not a marketplace of ideas. It's a sense-making commons, where we actually collectively give our perceptions and our best understanding of reality into a commons pool from which we can all pull out, and then at the edge we can engage in innovation and new science. And then we'll talk about more later about things like culture, family, community, and education, but notice how important that last bullet point is. If you're actually serious about this notion of network state, of new cities, if you can't build families, if you can't cultivate a real, vital, lived culture that can engage in intergenerational transmission, then you're just a tourist or a parasite on the existing system. And you can be a parasite on the existing system for a little while, but if I'm right, it's going away. So you probably ought to build good stuff. Whoops. So how? This one, hyperstructures, I hope is common currency here. If it's not, it needs to be. It's a fundamental category. It actually belongs in the realm of the commons. And think about Bitcoin. Once it's built, it replaces the notion of bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy is a way that we build institutions in the old slow AI modality, where we convert human beings into mediocre machines. Remember, the word computer meant a person who could do math quickly. And then we plug them into processes like a bunch of cogs. The problem with those kinds of bureaucratic institutions is they still have humans with human intents, desires, greed, political preferences inside of them. Hyperstructures, once they're designed, they just do what they do. They're just tools. So to the degree to which we can build hyperstructures that hold critical elements of our infrastructure as a commons, i.e. once they're built, they just run properly, that's a key element of this new transition. So think about that. If you're out there looking at how to build shared infrastructure, look at how you can build hyperstructures as a fundamental component, and then how human being groups, say for example DAOs, can interface with those. Primavera, if she's here, she's got some really good ideas about this. All right, two more that are big. New norms. Commons are often actually built by human relationships and how human beings interact with each other. Obviously, we're not going to be at the virtual level knowing each other well, which is where this whole new layer of ways of virtualizing reputation and relationships starts to become the key lever. So this is where things like soul-bound tokens will be part of the infrastructure. I expect that somewhere in that 2 to 3 year time frame, we will find that this is actually woven in deeply of how we do things. And then the other side of the equation, which here it's really nice. Like in most crypto environments, we don't think about the human piece, but things like radical subsidiarity and rebuilding localism, which is to say, render unto the human what is human and render unto the virtual what is virtual. I will propose as a hypothesis that under the liberation of these new virtual technologies, humans will actually begin to migrate away from high-density urban environments because they no longer need to be there to participate in generative activity. But the question is, how do we get them into places where they can actually tap into authentic humanness and be able to actually rebuild stuff that we left behind thousands of years ago, and certainly hundreds of years ago? Localism is a technique for that, right? How do we actually reorient supply chains so that people are depending on each other and at a scale where the human heart and the human mind can actually really map to what they're actually dealing with? So as an example, I was talking to some folks at a documentary that in principle, I care about Rio de Janeiro. I've never been there. So it's really just virtue signaling to my own mind that I actually have that degree of empathy. It's super lightweight. In practice, I really do care about the town that I live in a very material way, and I have adequate agency to deal with it properly. And so that's the other side of the equation, the virtual and the physical. And ideally, we move the physical as local and human scale as possible. And then finally, religion. I really feel like I need to bring that to the foreground because it's been so radically backgrounded, particularly in realms where people are operating in a highly technological modality. The modern world thought we could do without it. And the reality is that we've been actually eating the seed corn of religion now for 500 years, and the seed corn's just about gone. And a big part of the reason why our culture is disintegrating is because we've hollowed out this fundamental characteristic. So what do I mean by that? Of course, remember I said that the concept of the commons is confusing. We think of it as farmland when in fact it's things like language and math and money. Same thing with religion. Like we've really lost track of what this concept actually means. So as a provisional, the cultivation of values, which is both the recognition of what our values are and how they relate to each other in a proper fashion. And then practices that cause us to actually live those values as individuals and as communities. Now, if you think that through, obviously you're not going to be building anything vaguely like a society. I mean, you probably can't even build a club without doing that properly. But this is really hard and really important. And here's a big piece of where the stuff that came from the past is almost certainly necessary for us to actually do it in the future. I assure you, from first-person experience, if you think we hominids can reinvent these things that are thousands of years old over the next 10 or 15 years, just because we're really smart, you're going to have a hard day. And let me throw one last concept in because I love it. It's the new hotness for me. The concept is called liturgy. I just learned it in the last 6 or 7 months. The cognitive, bodily, totalizing act that steadily increases communion instead of cutting it. Right? These are really powerful, and many religions actually have liturgy woven in at their very, very center. What I propose is that we should be foregrounding these kinds of concepts. We should be engaging in liturgical lives as the key element of these new states. Not secondary, not tertiary. It's not money, it's not economics, it's not even longevity. It's liturgy. That's the centerpiece of any possible thing that human beings will care about enough that they'll be willing to give the lives of their children and their grandchildren to it, which, going back to the beginning, if you're actually serious about this, and not just play acting or having a good time in your 20s and 30s, that's what the answer has to look like. That's it.